Well, let me say hello as people are coming into our waiting room. We have a very large number of attendees scheduled for today, so we will be asking you to mute your microphones and to please block your cameras. Okay, we have a lot to cover, so I think it would be smart for us to get going. First, I'd like to thank all of you who are attending the session for joining us. We would appreciate it if you would keep your cameras blocked and your microphone on mute. We will probably not have time to take any questions, but feel free to put anything that you would like us to know into the chat box. Also, we will be recording the session and we will be posting it as well. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to Diane Boyle. She's the Senior Vice President of Government Relations, and she serves as our Chief Federal Lobbyist. She and her team also coordinate with NAIFA state chapters and industry coalition partners to advocate in every state capital on issues affecting insurance and financial professionals and their clients. Her team is heavily involved in the development of interstate models and regulatory issues. NAIFA was the only group representing producers to participate in the Federal Interagency Task Force on long-term care insurance. They regularly participate in the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC, National Council of Insurance Legislators, NCOIL, North America Security Administrators Association, NASA, and National Conference of State Legislators, NCSL deliberations. NAIFA's government relations, NAIFA's government relations team is closely involved with NAIFA Limited and Extended Care Planning Center's Legislative Working Group, which consists of LECP sponsors, insurers, and NAIFA members, third-party administrators, distributors, and other stakeholders. The group's mission is to explore and enhance policy positions for NAIFA through the association's government relations capability as it engages directly with lawmakers and regulators. So with that, I welcome Diane Boyle.
Thank you, Carol. And I always kind of chuckle whenever somebody gets to NASA, because, you know, whenever you say that, people kind of scratch their head like, NASA, what the heck does that have to do with insurance? Not that NASA. Our NASA deals with security, so it does keep us busy. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about amping up your advocacy voice. And you may be asking yourself, you know, why do I even need a voice? So we're going to start with today, we'll go over why you need an advocacy voice. We'll talk about conversations, what needs to be included in those, some of the state trends, federal efforts that are going on, the interstate initiatives, some of the challenges that we face, and some of the opportunities that we have in order to really amplify that advocacy voice, because each of you that are attending this have a level of expertise that is really needed in the conversation. If you look at some of the long-term care statistics, and you guys know these better than what I do, I put up just a few, is why you need an advocacy voice. There's a true need to address some of the challenges that we have with planning for long-term care services and supports, whether it's extended care or long-term care. There's a need there. This industry has the expertise to really sort of guide how we accomplish and make advances in the industry. And we know that the need is real. So that sort of leads into, okay, that there needs to be conversations whenever there's sort of a need. It brings attention to it and often brings in advocacy needs. We need to advocate for the industry. So also when I talk about advocacy, I'm really going to talk about more of not so much the consumer advocacy component, but really advocating with our lawmakers so that we then are advocating on behalf of the consumers and the clients that you guys serve, because we need the legislators to actually understand it just as much as we do the general public. And if you look at what's happened with COVID, we've really seen the spotlight focus on long-term care needs and the need for planning and the need and concerns that are out there. And NAIFA was very instrumental in making sure not only were people seeing and experiencing firsthand sort of how COVID impacted our older Americans living in nursing home and extended care facilities, but also how some of the older Americans were targeted and for scams and personal information. And so COVID really highlighted those two factors. And then whenever you have that spotlight on an issue, people start diving down, right? And then you say, okay, now that we know maybe being in a facility isn't the best situation, we know that people prefer to age in place. How do we put together policies that ensure that that option is available for individuals? And so it highlighted those conversations. And whenever you have highlighted challenges, there's also a turn to government, whether you're looking for a purely public option to address a concern, or if you're looking for a private option to address a concern, or if you're looking for a combination where you have public and private initiatives being discussed, there's a role for government in all of that. If you take even, just the private options, in order to offer a product, you're still having to go through a regulatory process in order to have that product approved. So even private options have a role for government. And so when the challenges of COVID hit, it amplified the need and the pressure that was put on government entities to say, you've got to do something, we have a situation. From the industry's perspective, that actually isn't the situation of what occurred because of COVID is horrific. So let me back up, as I was going to say, not necessarily a bad thing. The not necessarily a bad thing was that it put attention on a need that we already knew existed. That was the silver lining, if you will. So there are conversations that are being had about how do we address these problems that were there to begin with, highlighted and amplified during COVID and some of the instances that had occurred there. You're looking at Medicaid as the largest payer. So there's an incentive for both the state and the federal government to figure out a way to make this a more affordable option that's more accessible to more individuals. And so people are starting to talk. Whenever you have policy conversations in play, you have to factor in that there's also political ramifications too. So you can have the best policy in the world, but if you don't have the political momentum behind it, it's not going to move. And so that's something that actually NAIFA does really well. And we recognize that politics, the political side of things, absolutely comes into play when you're discussing policy. And so the way that we address this is we make sure that we work in coalitions. We make sure that we have centers like LACP so that we can have conversations and expertise put into policy development. And then you have to get that information out to the lawmakers, and you have to get it out to lawmakers in a credible way. You have to be a trusted resource, and there has to be industry consensus around what you're proposing. And so that's when you kind of get into what we call political mathematics, where you have to have the numbers that work. And policymakers are going to want to see broad support for policy in order to move it. And so at NAIFA, what we do is we enlist our members to develop relationships with their lawmakers, both at the state level and the federal level. Some of those relationships are natural. They're already in existence. You may have gone to school with someone who runs for office and is elected. You may have, your college roommate becomes a member of Congress. Your kids may play on the same little league team, or your grandkids. So there's a relationship there. Then there are other relationships that actually take a little more work. You didn't go to high school with a member of Congress, but you have a member of Congress and you have a level of expertise that they want to tap into. And trust me, they do want to tap into your expertise. So you start developing that relationship. And that's what we do at NAIFA, is we say, okay, if you have an interest in shaping policy, let's make sure that you have those relationships in order to be a credible source to provide information to the lawmakers on that policy. So how do you become politically involved? And those are the programs that NAIFA puts together to kind of make the political side of that work, so that you actually have a voice when it comes to advocacy. Conversations are no different than the conversations that you have with your clients. You actually have to start talking about it, and what we have with consumers. Those of you that participated in the Impact Week last year, I sat in front of you and said, who's going to lead long-term care policy efforts post-election? And we talked about the number of women legislators that were elected in record numbers. We talked about Congressman Swazi, not a woman, but a man, Tom Swazi from New York, who was starting to express an interest in long-term care issues. And so we said, you know what, let's watch them. That's where I think we're going to see some real activity and leadership on our issues, is from these newly elected women in mass, because women, as we know, tend to be the primary caregivers. And once you have that direct experience with caregiving, you have a greater appreciation for the need of planning for long-term care. And so I just think it's a natural market for us. Doesn't mean that we want to exclude any male who's elected and has an interest in the issue. I just think you have that experience where we hadn't had before. That was sort of a shift with the elections. Congress in this cycle is focused purely on reconciliation. So I don't know that we're going to get a lot of traction. So we haven't seen, even though we have this influx of women that are new to Congress and would be a natural market for us to have some of those conversations with, they're not occurring because of the process of what Congress is going through now with reconciliation, but they're going to still be there. And these are people that we can talk to. Another group that you may want to consider, and that we've been trying to look at, anytime you have reconciliation is designed to be a partisan process. So right now the Democrats are focused on reconciliation, getting consensus within the party in order to get this package passed and enacted. So what that does is it leaves all of the Republicans sort of on the sidelines. They really don't have a voice into that reconciliation process, other than to say, we don't like it, we're not going to vote for it, it's not our issue. So they're not focused on the policies contained within reconciliation, because it's a partisan process. So that leaves a good number of Republicans that might have some time on their hands. This might be a really good time for the industry to educate and develop those relationships with some of the Republican members to say, hey, this really needs to be a priority policy discussion item. How can we work together to get this done, and start planting those seeds? Something that we've done. Talking about conversations in general, though, I mentioned Tom Swazi, and if you haven't listened to Neil's program, and Beth is going to drop in the chat box a link to this actual conversation with the congressman, was exactly what we need to be doing. Now, Tom Swazi is a Democrat, so he is very much involved in the reconciliation conversations right now. So he's limited on his time as far as being able to take on a new initiative, but he has legislation that he's introduced, and he talks about that with Neil in this conversation that they had about long-term care and the crisis of planning. And what I think is particularly good about this conversation, and what I really like about Congressman Swazi, is that he's had that personal experience that we know leads to the desire and the understanding for policy, for planning, and for changes in order to move this forward. He talks about how he had to care for his parents. He talked about his grandparents living with him through the end of their life stages. He talks freely about the cycle of life, and that death is a natural part of that, and aging is natural and it's going to occur. And I think so often we find people resistant to having those conversations, but if you don't have the conversations, reality is going to happen whether you have the conversation or not. So if we can have the conversation, it leads to better planning. And I think these types of conversations are particularly helpful when you're looking at policy, because we know policy can kind of take, a direction of its own and not necessarily in a good way. So if you're having conversations, you can kind of ferret out where some of the shortfalls might be, develop consensus on where we want to go and how you can get there. And the more that you have conversations, and when we talk about having an advocacy voice and amping that voice up, anytime you talk to a lawmaker, they're going to want to know, what is it that you're advocating for? And tell me what obstacles I'm going to face. Who, Diane, after you talk to me about where we should be going on long-term care and planning and support and wellness, and how do we make the situation? Who's going to walk in my office behind you and disagree with you? And what parts are they going to disagree on? And so that's why you have to have those conversations, so that we can really come together and identify issues that will work, where there might be some challenges, make sure that we're all trying to go in the same direction, and then start putting the pieces together. And this industry absolutely needs to be a part of those conversations. If you have way too much expertise not to be in those conversations, you understand the actuarial science and the cost behind it. When we get to the challenges, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also on the wellness and how do you get the costs down? There's some really innovative ideas that are floating around that we can be a part of, that we should have those discussions. But let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about some of the state trends, because not only do we know that the issue is so incredibly important, we know that lawmakers are starting to engage. And if they're engaging and we're not part of those conversations, that's when we're going to find ourselves in trouble. And so if you look at the Washington Cares Fund, I think that's actually a really good example of well-intended effort, got some wind beneath its sails, went into effect, and it's going to cause it's facing some challenges. And we're seeing now that there may be some unintended consequences. You might not have thought everything through. How do you get through some of those challenges that were put in place after you enact something? Maybe we needed to take that back a step and have those conversations before something was enacted, so that we can think through. And as I said, the industry has a lot of good ideas. Right now, about half of those who have applied to opt out of the Washington Cares Fund program haven't been approved by the department for that opt out. And so they're looking at changes on how do you allow for those individuals who don't want to be part of the program, that actually have private insurance, to be accounted for. And then also on the flip side, which would make it more expensive and probably less sustainable, is that there pressure coming in that says, hey, wait a minute, you're going to have older Americans paying into the system for 8 years, but they're never going to receive any benefits. Is that right? How do we sweep those people in? Well, and if you're doing that at the same time, you've just created a situation that's going to make the program less sustainable, because you're having fewer funds coming in for the people that are private insuring. But you have a group of older Americans who are going to be eligible. I don't know at what point, if they actually make those changes. But if they're going to be essentially on claim, and that was something that we saw with the Class Act in Congress when that first went through, again, well-intentioned program, but actuarially unsound. And so it eventually unraveled. So let's figure out how we can put forth policy that's going to expand access, get more people planning, provide them the coverage that they need, but that is going to be sustainable. And so those are the kind of conversations. Washington is not the, maybe the first out there, but it's not going to be the only one. We know that we have activity in a number of states, and that's going to continue. You can see there's activity all over the place. It's not just on the West Coast. It's not just on the East Coast. It's down south and upper Midwest as well are all looking at what can we do to address this issue. And so that's where your voices really become important, because you can put together the type of policy and point out where there may be some roadblocks, where there may be additional opportunities, and how do we get going. If you look, it's not a partisan issue either. I very much pay attention to politics because it factors in how we actually move legislation. I always said, and I maintain, that insurance is not a partisan issue. And in here, you're seeing a good number of Democrats moving more forward in the state activity, but they're not alone. The Republicans absolutely have proposals as well. And so it still is a bipartisan initiative to have some type of legislation put in place that would advance long-term care support and services for older Americans. How you get there is always different. As I said earlier, we saw when COVID came into play that there was enhanced activity and issues. And you can see that on the timeline. You can see the spikes of when it came through. And I think we're going to see another spike come January after the election, and the state legislatures are back up and running and moving into activity. And it's not just on access. There are a whole host of different type of proposals and topics that come into play. You have rate regulation, there are partnership programs, renewals, there are studies that are out there, tax credits and incentives, some transparency issues, some working group issues or record keeping issues that come into play. And they're all over the place. The rate regulation, you're looking at 16 bills, and partnership programs, there are a couple there. Record keeping, there are 5 in New York alone. The renewal notifications, you're looking in Hawaii and New York. There are a number of different proposals in each of those states. There are 15 states looking to study the topic. And that's where I think we have some real opportunity. You're looking at Connecticut, California, Louisiana, New York, Vermont, Delaware, North Dakota are all looking at studying this issue. And I think, again, that's where you want to amp up that advocacy voice from the industry. We definitely need to be a loud, but thoughtful and respectful and educated voice in these discussions as they study it. There are 27 tax incentives bills that are out there throughout different states, and there are, I think, 5 or so transparency bills. So there's a number of activity across a broad range of topics that would improve long-term care industry and how we talk to consumers, how we get information out there, how do we make services available to them. And the working group is one that Carol leads really well. And we knew as Washington Cares was coming out that we really needed to gather a broad array of voices to come in and study and make recommendations, not only for how do we improve what Washington has done, but really making sure that we had established recommendations for the other states so that we can start picking up a model that works. Because once it sort of ekes through, the states tend to copy what another one does. There's a lot of copycat legislation within the states, and it doesn't necessarily copy just the good legislation. Sometimes they pick up the bad components, and if we're not there to say, wait a minute, you know, the concept is good, how do you improve it? And let's make sure that we put some spit and polish on it and make sure that it's actually working well. NAIFA California also came out and put together a similar working group to study just what California is working on so that we can have a voice in that process that's trusted, because again, the expertise that you have in this industry is tremendous. And we need to make sure that you're not doing it alone. And the only reason I say that you're not doing it alone is only because when you go back to that political side of things, the lawmakers are going to want to see broad consensus. So your idea and your concept may be spot on, but if you can't show that it has industry support, they're going to kind of shy away from it. And so that's why you really want to have that coalition type effort in order to move things forward. On the federal side, it gets a little crazy too. As I said, because we're so focused on reconciliation, Congress isn't looking at any new proposals. The reason that I even highlight the three that we have here is that legislation, especially on the federal level, actually takes a really long time to move. And so once proposals are drafted and introduced, they never go away though. They kind of go on a shelf periodically if Congress is focused on a different initiative. But when the topic comes up, or when there's sort of a lull in the pressure, or if it's an issue that a legislator cares about, they go and they pull off the shelf that previous proposal. So I always say, and people kind of laugh, I'm like, well, you just said that legislation was going to die. Why would you work to have the language amended? And it's because it's going to land on a shelf. Somebody's going to pull it off the shelf, blow the dust off, and reintroduce it. And when it's reintroduced, you want it to be reintroduced in a way that's favorable for the industry. So we watch proposals, even if they're not going anywhere. The WISH Act, that is what Congressman Swazi has introduced and that he cares about an awful lot. It's a catastrophic back-end coverage program. I think there's some challenges, and we're working through, and he's very open and will say that. I want to work with the industry. I want this to be a public-private partnership. I want to put something forth that is sustainable and that will truly be a benefit to my constituents and to Americans across the board. So bring your ideas to me. And so we are. That's part of what the working group is doing. They're looking through, figuring out where there are opportunities there. A credit for caregiving. This is something that we've seen for years. There's always been or I shouldn't say always, but there very often have been proposals that do a combo, which is something that we step in and generally are very supportive of and advocate for. And that's the combination of the caregiver tax credit combined with some type of incentive for private purchase. And so that brings in the planning component of those that aren't on claim yet, should be planning, should be contributing, should be making efforts in order to make sure that they're addressing the financing of their long-term care needs. And then we want to incentivize them to do that. And then you have to recognize that there are already people in a situation where they're providing care. They're not eligible for a policy because they are already on claim. So can we give them some type of tax credit in order to recognize that they're in a situation that they're no longer eligible to purchase coverage for? So that's sort of the tax credit component with regards to unpaid family caregiving. Then there's a Long-Term Care Affordability Act, and that would allow for the use of a certain dollar amount for qualified long-term care policy. We are working, Senator Toomey is who introduced that, and we're working with him to make sure that we modify that language so that it does include some of the hybrid policies. I think he's missing out on a lot of the innovation and where we're seeing the interest of consumers and what they actually want to buy. So we want to make sure that we modify that legislation. There's a whole host, again, if you go back to congressional proposals in general, talking about the number of women that are in Congress now and have experience with caregiving. I think we're going to start seeing an uptick in activity. What we want to see from NAIFA when we see these congressional proposals introduced, we need something that's bipartisan, because in reality, except when you're in a situation where you're putting something through reconciliation, you're going to get better policy, even if you have the numbers. If you don't have to use reconciliation, but if you have a piece of legislation that is enacted on a partisan basis, what happens is the parties change. The next Congress is going to come in, and if you didn't have the buy-in from the other party, you're just going to have a flip of party, and they're not going to support it. They're going to want to start over. They're going to want to take that initiative out completely and introduce something of their own. If you have a proposal that has bipartisan support and it's enacted, it doesn't matter when Congress changes, you're always going to have both sides looking at, okay, we don't need to demonize what was put into place, but there may be tweaks that can be made. No piece of legislation is perfect. So how do we improve it? And then you have some continuous improvement and advancement of policy rather than a stop and start situation when you have partisan legislation. And so that's what we really look for. Again, adding the voices to make sure that we can get those proposals, make sure that they're bipartisan. That gives you the ups and downs from a political perspective of, you know, what would work with this group, what wouldn't work with that group, why, and have those conversations. And then we can move some of those congressional proposals forward. In addition to just pure long-term care and extended care legislation, it's also, how do you get people in the business? How do you move forward? I don't know how many of you remember NARAB, which was the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers. And what this did, it was in 2015 that Congress passed NARAB 2, which put in place a board. The president was to nominate individuals to serve on that board. And what it does is it streamlines licensing. So if you are licensed in one state, you take your home state's licensing exam, you would take a second exam and testing through NARAB. And then you would have reciprocity in all of the states. And it was something that was supported by the NAIC. The states liked it, NAIFA liked it. We thought it was a great idea. If you look at the photo, the gentleman on the far left, closest to us is Tom McCleary. He was a former NAIFA trustee. He was actually nominated in 2015 by President Obama. He passed the background checks. There had to be background checks in order to serve on the board. But it never went to the Senate committee for the nominees had to be confirmed, never made it through that process in the Senate. So the Obama administration ends, NARAB board isn't appointed. Trump administration comes in and they don't do anything with it. And so we're now getting back into, again, pressing the administration to say, these are presidential appointments that can be made that would put together a board for NARAB that would allow for the streamlining of licensing that would get more people into the business across state lines. You know, you're seeing people that are more transient now, and so we need to make that process easy. We have candidates such as Tom McCleary, who has been vetted and cleared. Let's go ahead and stand up the board. Now, some of the Obama appointees or nominees for the board in 2015, there were a certain number that had to be commissioners, and there were a certain number that had to be representative of the industry. Some of the commissioners that were actually nominated are no longer commissioners because it was 6 years ago. so they'll have to have new nominees. But what we're pushing for in the conversations that we're having with the administration now is you have a slate of candidates that have been vetted. Let's use some of those. You're going to obviously have to augment in where some of the commissioners have changed, but let's get this process going. And I share NARAB not only because licensing is an important part of what we do, but also because of the time frame. Things move really slowly. And so we want to be very deliberative in what we're doing so that when we eventually get to the point where we have something that goes through, that it's where we want it to be. So NARAB is an instance of where we're working not only with the legislators, but actually working with the regulators too. Another proposal that sort of falls into that arena is there's a Senate Special Committee on Aging. They reached out to us and said, you know, can you tell us what is the industry, what is NAIFA doing to protect older Americans? And this was more on some of the financial security exploitation, but it also included how do you educate people as they start to age as to what should they be planning for? How do you improve their financial literacy? And just yesterday, well, we submitted that information, but yesterday had a phone call with the committee staff saying we're looking to put together, and this is what I love about it, a bipartisan paper on financial literacy for older Americans. And obviously part of that financial literacy includes making sure that you have a plan for long-term care needs. You have to have that as part of that financial literacy or wellness, if you will, financial wellness, so that people know what they're doing. NAIFA not only is actively engaged in financial literacy efforts, we, work with individuals to make sure that they're adjusting their budgets so that they're covering all of their needs. We worked on what was called the Senior Safe Act to make sure that senior citizens weren't financially exploited. We worked with FINRA on similar proposals. And then we worked with AARP on a bank safe program. And that was more of a training program so that our members who are working with older Americans actually know the signs of when someone is either being exploited, whether they're showing signs that they really need to have someone else work with them on their financial aspects of their life, that there's some delay or lack of ability to make those decisions on their own. And so the program that's put through AARP, NAIFA works with them to make sure that our members have access to that program, which allows for better representation from the industry when working with these communities. We also work there within the federal government under Treasury. There's a Financial Literacy Education Commission, and they too look at making recommendations not only to Treasury, the Department of Labor, HHS, and some of the other agencies to make sure that they're working through this Financial Literacy and Education Commission to make sure that they have resources on long-term care. And so NAIFA serves as a resource to this commission as well to make sure that we're helping them understand the role of the industry so that when they're working with Treasury and Health and Human Services or the Department of Labor, that they're talking to each other so that we don't have one agency doing something here and another agency going down a completely different path, that they're kind of coordinated and that they're able to work together to make sure that we're addressing it. And they each have their own little segment. The Department of Labor, how are you getting to workers? With HHS, it's more on the health side of it, and Treasury obviously is the financing of it, but it all plays together. They're all interactive. So we want to make sure, and that's the concept behind this commission, is to make sure that they're putting recommendations forth so that we can reach consumers in a consolidated and comprehensive manner. And if you think that's not enough, so if you go back to the political mathematics where we talk about you can do it on your own, but do you really want to? We've only gotten through the state and the federal, and I'm not done because there's a whole interstate component to advocacy. And that includes some of those agencies that Carol mentioned early on, where you're talking about the NAIC, where the commissioners are putting together model legislation and regulation. NASA also has model legislation and regulations. In CSL, which is the state legislators, they're looking at models. And we want to make sure that we have a say in what's going on. I just wrote all over my slide. I'm not sure how I did that. We want to make sure that we have those conversations. And so by partnering with NAIFA, by participating in the LACP or LACP, you're actually able to consolidate what each of you know and rely and amplify your individual voices into a collective voice as we work with these different groups. And again, I apologize. I have no idea how I wrote on my screen. I don't know if you're seeing that or not, but I have a big purple loop. The NAIC, so the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, they do put together different models. They're working on an initiative, and NAIFA regularly attends and participates in these conversations and deliberations of the commissioners, and to provide testimony and information from the industry perspective. This I think is really interesting, is they're looking at how do you put in place wellness benefit programs as it relates to long-term care. And so it's something that we've seen in other areas. In health insurance, certainly there's a wellness component that has been percolating up, and a recognition that there's a space and a cost benefit for putting in a wellness program. But how do we put wellness programs into the long-term care space? And so that's something that they're working on, and we're offering information. I had a conversation, as a matter of fact, with Carol, where on the fall prevention programs, where my mother is actually going through a program that's used for divers when they have the bends. And it's something that helps with balance. And so is that something that they're, legislators would be interested in learning more about? Are there different programs? How do you work those in? What is the role of technology? And so these are all of the conversations that we're having with the NAIC that ultimately will result in model legislation or recommendations that the commissioners then take back to their individual states for adoption. And the benefit of really working with the NAIC is that you do have that model legislation, because the industry professionals, this, if you're moving from one state to another, and there need to be some differences. We recognize that insurance is regulated on the state basis, and there's good reason for that, but you don't want to have wildly different programs from state to state. So if you have a model, then it allows for the states to adopt what's best for their state, while still really conforming to, we had input into the process, and we have a model that kind of works across the board. And so that is something that we're really involved in. The other thing, there are other committees at the NAIC that we're working with, making sure that, again, that consumer protection component is really big. We've seen the dollars that are going towards deceptive sales, or actually people preying on older Americans, is tremendous. And so that protection component is out there. Also looking at reduced benefit options is another really engaging topic at the NAIC right now. They're looking to figure out, how do you get coverage to different individuals? And, is a reduced benefit option a good thing? And how do you develop a checklist for the regulators is something that the NAIC is doing, so that regulators know how you can put in a reduced benefit option, but you've checked the different obstacles or challenges that could come about when offering a reduced benefit. So that's something that the NAIC and NAIFA are working on. We testify before these organizations. So when you go back to amplifying your voice, that's what we do. We take the voice of the industry and we present it at the NAIC. We have, as a matter of fact, our policy director, it was on her way to Tampa to testify before the NCSL, the Conference of State Legislatures, on the NAIC model. That was, so there's, even within the interstate agencies, there's kind of crossover between the different groups. And so there was an NAIC representative, a NAIFA representative, and someone from the IRI were scheduled to testify. Unfortunately, she was flying American and she had some issues. So she's going to be doing that presentation very much like I am by Zoom today. But we also present before the National Council of Insurance Legislators as well. And Boyle is very active, and NAIFA plays an active role there. So we want to make sure that you have that voice, you have that expertise, you utilize NAIFA as a trusted resource to make sure that we are amplifying your voice before these different agencies that are taking on the responsibilities of putting together and advancing coverage for long-term care and services. So there are a number of challenges. Many you already know. I'm going to share a few that I think are really key when you're looking at legislation. The cost. Providing long-term care services is just expensive. And there's a science behind it. The actuarial studies that go into determining what the appropriate cost for coverage would be comes into play. If you're talking about Congress looking at proposals, most of their financing is done in a 10-year budget window. So it gets really tricky to show how do you put together a program that you're going to have to fund now. Then they're going to have a 10-year window, but benefits aren't going to be paid yet. So when you're looking at the savings that putting in some of the initiatives that are policies that we've advanced previously, you're not going to see that cost lift or that relief on Medicaid, if you will, within that 10-year budget window. And so it doesn't score well when you're looking at putting a proposal. That's a challenge. That requires somebody to think beyond just the 10-year budget window and look more comprehensively and long-term at policy. And that's not always done. The other challenge that I think is significant that we face is that sometimes they come up with faulty legislative solutions. And if you look at North Dakota this year, which I think is a great idea, that they wanted to study the issue of long-term care and policies. But their initial proposal was to impose a 3-year ban on the sale of long-term care insurance policies. That was insane. So NAIFA engaged, and luckily we were able to shut down that proposal. But sometimes you have well-intended individuals that say, you know what, let's just take a pause and we'll think about this. But you can't shut down the sales of long-term care policies for 3 years. So sometimes the proposed solutions aren't exactly the answers that we're looking for. Those are some of the challenges that we find. And again, time. It takes a really long time to work things through the legislative process, whether it's on the state level, on the federal level, or even in some of these interstate agencies. There are different players and different perspectives that come in and have to be sifted through in order to figure out how do you advance that policy. So not only are you taking policy and trying to get consensus and agreement around policy and what you're trying to achieve, you're then pulling in the political factors of how much is this going to cost? Is it going to be perceived as a win when I go back to my constituents? And that's what legislators actually need to prove. And is it going to work? So do you have the numbers within the legislative body to advance an initiative? And all of that takes time. And so when you're faced with a situation where you want to make incremental steps, and you're looking at groups that want to see big wins, it makes it difficult to figure out what can you actually get done. And so it does take time. And like I said, on the above the line deduction for long-term care insurance combined with a tax credit for caregivers, we've been talking about that for easily 25 years in Congress, and it hasn't moved. So do we need to have different conversations? Do we need to have other initiatives that we're pushing forward? And we think the answer to that is yes, which is why we have the LECP and the working group sorting through some of the proposals to say, what can we do? Where can we find agreement within the industry? And then how can we put those proposals in front of lawmakers, get that broad support that they want to see, and advance the cause? And so that's what we're working on. There are a lot of opportunities, and I think NAIFA, you'll find, is a really good one. We've been working at this for over 130 years, representing the industry. We have considerable political influence on all levels. We work, as we've mentioned today, the federal level and the state capitals, and we work with those interstate agencies to make sure that we have model laws going in place. We spend a lot of time making sure that we develop those trusted relationships. And I think that's what is key when you're trying to amplify that advocacy voice, is to make sure that you are a trusted resource. Develop those relationships. I don't doubt that everyone participating in this program today is an expert within this industry. But do the lawmakers perceive you as an expert in the industry that they can trust? And that trust takes time. That trust takes building a relationship. And NAIFA tries to help our members develop those trusted relationships by getting you involved, amplifying that voice of yours to make sure that we can advance our advocacy efforts and really get in good policy. You'll see there are a number of, over the years, some of the activity of NAIFA on long-term care just over the past few years. And we've made some strides in the right direction. There's still a lot more that can be and should be done. We look forward to working with you to make sure that we're achieving those goals. One of the things, if you're not a member, you absolutely should join, in my opinion, my humble opinion, so that you can be part of our advocacy efforts. We want to hear from you. We represent the individuals that work directly with consumers. So we want to have you as part of our group. If you want to test us out a little bit, I would recommend attending the congressional conference this year, or in 2022. It'll be May 23rd and 24th in Washington, D.C. Capitol's in a weird kind of place right now. The combination between the pandemic and Capitol security, it has the dynamics of how you can interact on the Capitol a little wacky. I'm hoping by May those will sort out, so we may have a different type of experience. But what we do, and everyone's welcome, you don't need to be a NAIFA member to attend. We put you into groups. We want to make sure that you're visiting with your representative and your senators, and that you're having conversations on a number of issues that we typically pull together. We try to limit it to 3. So I certainly can't tell you what those 3 will be today. That will be active and relevant in May, but it gives you an idea of how we work and develop those relationships with lawmakers. And it really is, I think, a phenomenal program. It puts you in touch with other of your colleagues to participate in some of these meetings. Some have really strong relationships with the legislators, which you'll witness. Others are new to political activity, and it makes it nice that you go in a group and we're prepared with talking points and background documents and all of those good things. But it really is an interesting event to attend. We typically will cover, and this goes back to sort of the credibility and developing that trusted relationship with the lawmakers. We'll cover 95% of Congress in that single day when we're on the Hill. And what that does, even if the 5% that we don't hit have seen everyone else. And so they know, oh, that's right, the insurance group is here and we need, what are they talking about? What are their issues? So even without touching the office, you're creating an optic of influence and respect that's really important. And the legislators talk to each other. So even if he didn't cover that 5%, the 90% that you did cover will probably be having a conversation with those 5. So it actually works. I see there's some comments in the chat box. I'm going to stop sharing my screen with the crazy purple mark. And I'm going to see if I can get to the chat box real quick and see if there are comments there. And then,
well, while you're doing that, Diane, let me just remind everybody that, first of all, let me thank you on behalf of the people who did attend today's session. And I know many of them will want to hear a replay. That was a lot of information. And I think it's important for everybody to understand that this is the agent, advisor, and agency's voice. And we want to hear from you. Membership is very affordable, but it is important to you as a professional. We need to understand your issues, your opinions. It counts. But as Diane said, it is easier and more effective to work as a group so that they understand that this is a coalition. NAIFA has very strong coalitions and partnerships with other associations as well. So I would encourage you to reach out. And Diane, I don't know that you have a lot of time for questions, but I will be quiet for a moment so that you can perhaps answer a question here if you'd like.
I saw more statements and questions in the chat box, so I think we're good, Carol. So I will turn it back over to you. I know Harlan is ready to go, and I am happy if folks have questions afterwards, simply send them to us and we'd be happy to get those questions answered for you. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate being here. I look forward to doing more on the long-term care and extended planning front. We need more of it, and I really appreciate the time today. Thank you for participating in Impact Week. It's going to be a great week. The rest of the program looks really phenomenal. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. And thank you, attendees.